Hi, I'm Joe Guinan, CEO of Advantage Futures. Here with me today is Professor Tassos Malliaris, Professor of Economics at the Quinlan School of Business, University of Loyola. Professor, thank you for joining me here today. So the first and biggest question I think on everybody's mind is, let's talk about the Fed. When can we expect liftoff?
Well, if you had asked me this question 2 or 3 weeks ago, I would have been a little more certain than I am right now. And the reason is that Yellen, in a very important speech that she gave to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst 3 weeks ago, essentially indicated that they were ready to increase interest rates, but difficulties in China hesitated the board from doing so. But she proceeded to add that she was hoping, or she felt sufficiently confident that before the end of 2015 there would be the first increase after something like 7 or 8 years.
Right.
However, you probably read the news as I do. The last couple of weeks, 3 or 4 board members and governors started indicating certain concerns, and they said, yes, the situation in China is troublesome, risky. At the same time, however, all of a sudden, we were having very successful monthly new employment figures of 200,000. All of a sudden, we have an increase much shorter than 200,000. Mm-hmm. Oops, is the economy having any difficulties? This raised some red flags. In addition to that, inflation numbers came very weak. And some people said, you know what, it's better to be cautious. It would be a big mistake to increase interest rates by 25 basis points, and then 2 or 3 months down the road, realize that we made a mistake, we did it prematurely. Of course, on the other camp, people say, what do you mean prematurely? We've been waiting for the last 8 years. How long can we last? So, at this point, in terms of the data that we all know and the things that we read, it is not likely that they will do anything in November. If there is anything to be done with additional data, the last hope they have, the last possibility that exists for an increase is in December. I somehow believe that this may happen, but I'm not as confident as I would have been 3 or 4 weeks ago, where there was sufficient guidance that they were going to do it before the end of 2015.
Right. So if they are going to do it in December, after the December meeting, when they have a press conference scheduled, would you expect that between now and then we could get a few more outspoken comments from the people who have all along been saying this year? For example, Janet Yellen, yes. Stanley Fischer, and Mr. Dudley. Is it possible that we hear more from them over the next few weeks, reasserting that they expect the rate hike this year? Would you expect that if it's going to happen this year?
I do not believe it is in Yellen's personality to take a very strong position, because she tries to build up a consensus, and they do not want to give the impression that they do not tolerate dissension and different. If you may remember, some of us going all the way back to Greenspan very seldom tolerated dissension. Mm-hmm. I mean, and the interesting thing was that he always spoke and says, this is my view, and everybody followed. But there are different styles. Bernanke, for instance, let all the people speak, and he was last. And Yellen tries to be a little more conciliatory as a leader. So it's an issue of leadership. And I believe it's important for Yellen to lead with a big consensus, rather than say, this is what small group of us believe, and the rest of you are encouraged to follow us.
Right. So a big consensus. Right now we know of perhaps 2 or 3, at least 3 Fed governors who have mentioned they do not want a rate hike this year. They've been outspoken saying that. So if we have 3 that do not want to raise this year, is that already too much of a...
I'm afraid so, and I'll tell you why. I watch very carefully Stan Fisher, who is a professor, a former professor, and actually he started his career at the University of Chicago in 1972 as a young man, and then he went back to MIT, and of course he was both as a governor of the Bank of Israel. He already said, when people pressed him, he says, you and Yellen were thinking in terms of an increase. Are we proceeding to count on this increase? And he said, we expected, we are not committed. And I read those 2 words very carefully. So even he's not saying no, but he's saying, don't put words in my mouth. I said, we expect, we are not committed.
But he also is an expert at wordsmithing.
Yes, yes.
And he also said when he was in Europe in September that the message he heard from the European central bankers was, get on with it, raise rates.
Correct, correct. The Europeans somehow want us to proceed with certain increases. This would be both good and bad for them. It would be good in the sense that the euro will get a little weaker, and this may help their economy. At the same time, it will send a signal to the European business people. Watch out, take advantage of low interest right now, because we, like the Americans, eventually will increase the interest rates. So we're not going to be here forever. So this will expedite the quantitative easing from the European point of view. But at the same time, right now, the Europeans are a little ambivalent in the sense that, okay, if there are increases in the interest rates, to what extent do we want the euro to weaken further? There is a challenge in terms of them feeling very, very comfortable with us proceeding with further increases. And somehow the developed countries are complaining, the developing countries. They say, you know, you guys are going to increase interest rates and stimulate the global growth, but we're having difficulties with our own currencies. So you have people from the Central Bank of India saying, you know, take a little longer time. The Europeans take a little longer time. So the bottom line, the decision is no longer, it is primarily American, but there is the additional dimension of the global situation.
Right. And net European central bankers probably net at this point would encourage us to get on with it and raise rates.
Well, correct. The situation in Europe is different than in us. In Europe, they have very high unemployment, close to 10%, but the charge of the European Central Bank is watch inflation. And because inflation is almost close to zero, Draghi says, we are doing quantitative easing, while quantitative easing in America was to help employment, quantitative easing in Europe is to stimulate inflation. And in that sense then, Draghi wants to see success in the United States and the United States to move to the next step so that the signal around the world, you see, no one wants a situation like in Japan where for 15 years they never stopped quantitative easing and the economy never really took off.
Right.
So what used to be the second biggest economy in the world, Japan, for the last 10 or 15 years has not really performed well.
But did they actually have quantitative easing I think for the first 20 years they had zero interest rates, but they really didn't want to have print money. They didn't want to have quantitative easing. And so really Japan what they failed to learn was that quantitative easing was a tool they perhaps should have used in the 90s and didn't. And then after the U.S. used it so aggressively, they've now joined our pattern with quantitative easing.
Yeah, correct. In view of the fact that they waited and they didn't do it in sufficient scale, it has never really had any impact, because when you start with interest rates, long-term bond rates, 50 basis points, I mean, how much quantitative easing can do to you?
Right.
Raise it, reduce it by how much? So Japan remains in the background as an example of a very big economy that somehow did not handle things very well. And Europe, for the first time, after 3 or 4 years of a big clash between France and Germany and Italy and the camp that said we need to grow, as opposed to the German austerity, and Greece suffered an awful lot from the German austerity. Now, it's not true that the austerity is out the window, because they don't have the fiscal institutions to expand fiscally and to stimulate the economy. But in terms of monetary policy, what the Germans objected in 2008, 9, and 10, finally Mario Draghi was successful to convince them and say, we do not have the tools for a fiscal stimulus, given that we're not one economy, one country, one sovereign nation.
One tax base.
One tax base. but will follow quantitative easing to achieve the goal of at least having 2% inflation.
Right.
And now we hear news that there will be perhaps a second round of European quantitative easing starting perhaps later this year or early next year.
I think they had some meetings, and already Mario Draghi indicated that they will remain firm at what it is that they're doing, and that they will continue with quantitative easing. And he enjoys repeating the statement, we will do whatever is necessary. And it was that statement that he made almost a year ago that ultimately prevailed in the negotiations with Greece, because Greece staying or not staying, there were all sorts of threats to the euro, and Draghi said, we will try to find a solution so that the euro, an institution that we tried to nourish and develop and promote over the years, does not really experience any important risks.
So they did succeed in keeping Greece in the euro, and in fact Greece has sort of faded from the headlines in the past few months. Do you think they've faded for good, or can we expect a new Greek drama down the road?
First of all, I personally am delighted that all this big news, I would get up the past 6 months every morning, and here is Greece moving markets around the world, and I felt probably unwisely very responsible. You know, what are the Greeks doing? Bring the markets up and the markets down, because they were dealing with a substantial debt for Greece, 300 billion, but you know, a 1% increase in the S&P 500 is significantly much more. So here is Greece. I mean, why wouldn't people write a check to Greece and say, here is 1% of my wealth, just solve your problem so that the market can take off and I can make 5. Would you trade 1 for 5?
You'd think somebody might make that bailout decision,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. So the important thing is, the way I see it is that the Greek people, and I was in Greece when all those things was happening. I spent 1 week absolutely in peace, and all of a sudden there were credit card limitations. Of course, mine would work because it was an American credit card, but if you had a Greek credit card, you could not withdraw more than $60. And the interesting things that I noticed is because they loaded all the bank machines with 20s, there was a scarcity of 20s. So wherever you went to eat, if you paid in 20s, they gave you a deal. And if you gave them a $100 bill, they said, you know, this is too much. I'm not going to give you my 20s. I had reservations at the Hyatt in Thessaloniki, and I had paid in advance from the United States. I go there and they say, Professor, we can improve and give you a suite. We can give you free dinner. You can have drinks. How many 20s do you have? 20 euros. So I gave it. So because of the restrictions in how much money could take out of it, there was a massive panic. The people, however, said, no matter how tough the rules are for us to stay in Europe, Greece belongs to Europe. We do not want to be just an average Balkan country. We will do it. And the determination of the people, despite the fact they had repeated elections and referenda, and Mario Draghi and the Europeans, the Germans were ready to tell Greece, take a short vacation, which would have been a permanent vacation. Because they left, it would have been very difficult for them to return. So I'm pleased that things worked out. What will happen the next couple of years is difficult to predict. Some people are very pessimistic and say Greece will not be able to have the money to pay back the commitments. I believe the new government has no political baggage. It's completely new and fresh, and they will do the best that they can to bring fiscal discipline and improve the situation.
Well, some of the arguments that people would make would be that, number one, the total Greek indebtedness is not possible to repay, and so that at some point in the future, the European lenders need to be more realistic and have some sort of debt forgiveness. And I think from the European side, there is a belief that structural reform is needed in Greece, including talking about older retirement ages and pulling back the level of government pensions and so on. Would you expect those sorts of topics to be part of a future deal, so to speak, a big deal, including Greece and the Europeans?
Yes. The current situation is such that people finally, after 3 or 4 years, have accepted that we will not have option number 4. They had the first, they had the second. This one came very, very close to completely unraveling. And they were under the impressions, the Greeks, and the politicians fed that expectation, that the reason we have problem, the first set and the second set of negotiations and all those deals, we were not strong enough to negotiate. Well, this time, for 6 months, they tried to be very tough. And they said, we don't accept this deal, we don't accept this deal. Instead of us changing, the whole Europe needs to change. Well, the rest of Europe kept saying, it is unreasonable, a small country, because it has a referendum and because 5 million people say, we don't like what Europeans are doing to us, Europe should change instead of us changing. So please take a vacation. And when they heard take a vacation, I was there and I saw how discouraged they were, because they were nurturing a dream which was totally unreal.
Right.
When you are in need, and you owe money, you don't go over there and say, well, you should be generous and give me the money. And they were talking about how Greece had given money to the Germans during the occupation. So now they all know that there is no choice number 4. And the government is committed to it, and the people, of course, that's the optimistic way. To be realistic, something in between will happen. There will be some concessions, the economy will do a little better, and they will get through it. The fact that they overcame the recent obstacle makes me optimistic that the future will be a little better.
In terms of some political reform in Greece, getting broadening the tax base seems to be a critical step that's necessary. There's maybe, and I've never been to Greece, so obviously you're in a much better place than me to talk about this, but it seems there's more of a culture of tax avoidance over there, and large swaths of the economy paying zero tax. And how do you culturally change that? And does the current government have the political will, even if they have the power to do it and the desire to do it, do they have the will to take the steps necessary to try to inflict that cultural pain?
Yeah, it's the situation in Greece is as more or less as follows. Anyone who is on a regular payroll, let's say you are a teacher or you're an accountant or you are a nurse, they pay taxes because, like in the United States, they are held at the source. So you work, and like I work at Loyola University, and every month they give my salary, 20%, 30%, whatever it is given, sent directly. The problem is because Greece is very entrepreneurial in terms of small businesses, not huge corporations. When you have a huge corporations, you have to pay taxes, correct?
Right.
They're after you. So if there is a Toyota dealership in Greece, they pay taxes. But if you have a small shop and you you sell flowers, or a dry cleaning,
Or a doctor.
or a doctor, or you go to a small restaurant. I mean, a couple of summers ago, out nowhere in a beautiful southern part of Greece, my wife, my daughter, and my son were having lovely fish, and actually one lady was cooking it while her husband was in a boat and catching it. Lovely food. She comes at the end and she says, this and this and this, 60 euros. And I said, where is the tax? She says, do you see anyone around here who could possibly claim that he's a tax collector? My daughter looks at me very American and says, Daddy, insist that you pay. Don't make me feel shame of you. So I said, please add 20%. She says, I want you to know, I'll keep it. And I said, please, we love our country. Collect it. She says, I need a computer, I need machines. He says, I have 20 tables and my husband catches the fish. I cook it and I sell it. He says, we don't have anything to get organized. This was 2 years ago. When I was in June, in the midst of the crisis, I went to buy a €1 bottled water. The guy gave me a receipt. I said, why are you giving me a receipt? I'm new. He says, I don't know you. If they catch me not collecting tax and keeping it, there is a €5,000 fine.
Oh, good.
So things are improving.
Yeah.
Also, Greece is being inundated these days with a lot of these refugees coming out of Syria and the Middle East. Apparently tens of thousands a day.
It is a very sad situation because the immigration, as you know, there are many routes. Actually, the New York Times had a beautiful map. There are 5 or 6 routes. They go all the way from Spain. Then there is another one through Italy and Morocco and Algiers. Then there is another one through Lebanon. And then the new one opened up because it is very easy to go from Syria to Turkey, and then 5 miles from Turkey is a Greek island called Kos, and everybody is left there. These, according to the data and what I read, are people who are upper middle class professionals, doctor, business people, many of them Christians, and they're scared of ISIS. And they realize that if they don't move, they may be killed. So you hear rumors that they sell their businesses and whatever money they have, and with as much money as possible. It used to be initially men, but now you see on television that it is a man with his wife and 2 kids, and lots of young kids. So Greece now receives all these people and has to register them. And we don't have obviously the resources to make tents and to support them and to keep them. Very few people know that Greece a few years ago started accepting immigrants from Albania. And Greece is about 10 million, 1.5 million are refugees, Albanians, who come and live there. And Middle East people come and live there. Some people on the light side says we need these people to work and contribute to Social Security so the retirees can make money. But that's a small comfort. So the Greek government now, the immigrants found a way to go to Germany via the former Yugoslavia, Macedonia, and Bosnia, all the way to Hungary. So they exploited that opening. So what's happening then is that the Greek government, at its own expense, takes them from the islands to Piraeus. To Piraeus, they put them in buses, they take them to Macedonia. Then they pay, and there is transportation that goes further. And now, there have been so many people that Germany cannot absorb anymore, and there is a big difficulty. How could they all get together to coordinate future movements?
Yeah, it's certainly it's a global problem.
Yes.
So let's move away from Europe a bit and move over to China. The big news in August, of course, for us was China and the slowdown in China growth, and what's the impact of that on the rest of the world. We witnessed what happened in August in our markets, and my question to you is, how important is China to us? How concerned do we need to be if they slow down? How much can we believe the numbers? If they say it's 6.9%, is it really 6.9? And how important are they to us?
Well, obviously, United States is not dependent in a big way on China, maybe 5%, 7% GDP, imports, exports. So it's not that China will slow down and immediately will go into a recession. So this is not the situation. The same thing, United States, as you know, is a very big, well-diversified economy doing very, very well. Mm-hmm. The issue is somehow a little more indirect, because we have encouraged China, but also on their own, they're smart enough to realize that as an emerging economy, they cannot sustain what they used to experience 10, 12% growth by exporting, because the rest of the world could not really absorb those huge productions of shoes and clothing and the rest of it. So when we went, and Europe went into a recession in 2008 and 9 because of the crisis, China experienced a big shock because they were growing primarily as an exporter and not a domestically grown economy. Mm-hmm. So around 2009-10, with our own encouragement, but their own realization, they said, how can we restructure our economy so that the billion-plus people we have, they start spending domestically, and we become less reliant on exports. Well, that is like trying to turn around Quinlan in the Chicago River, correct? It doesn't happen in 6 months or a year. It may take 10 or 15 years. You and I may remember that Japan experienced that in the 80s. Remember, they kept growing, selling cars, television, and finally it reached a saturation point, and they said, wait a minute, that's when they had their crash. Because, so in China then, they tried to turn it around, and it was a brilliant idea that, well, if we want consumers to spend and buy houses and to buy cars and to buy goods, well, we need to make them wealthy. We need the middle class. Let the stock market go up. And they somehow encouraged people to invest in the stock market. In that process, turned out to be the creation of a bubble. And that's what we experienced in June, when finally they couldn't push the market any higher and it dropped. So the concern then is, that China will have to turn around, but the fact that their economy is not doing well is causing Brazil, it's causing India, it's causing all the Arab world. There's no demand for oil. And immediately what happened? The price of oil dropped as well. So China cannot affect directly United States, but because its economy is now the number 2, maybe number 1, not per capita, but in total GDP, then it has impacted the developing nations. They were all over Africa, you remember, all over Latin America. They were pouring money, and those countries were doing well. Now that they're growing at 4 or 5%, these countries are weakened. So currently we have then a problem with a slow Europe, slow China, and emerging countries where all the money went there to be invested because of future opportunities, and how many people had really lots and lots of money in Brazil, and Brazil all of a sudden is having difficulties because their loans are denominated in dollars, and when their currency gets weak, the burden is much bigger. So it's the indirectness of China's impact that becomes relevant.
And you think that their growth rate right now might be more in the 4 or 5% rather than the...
Probably so, because you see the exports are very weak, and domestically they have overbuilt, so they don't need more building. They have lots and lots of cars. The people continue to be frugal. It's a nation that have experienced so many difficulties over the years. I mean, they save 30% of their incomes. They don't go out and spend. They don't believe big in credit cards like we do. So that has to change. So I think it's a longer term problem. It's not, it cannot be solved in a year or two. And that's why, to go to another topic, people like Larry Summers says we're having a stagnation for a few years, not only in the US, but around the globe.
So the Chinese seem to have no problem when their stock market was up 60% of the year, and yet when it gave back half of that, that was considered to be a huge problem. And we saw the Chinese government essentially pulling every lever they could to stop the market from going down any further. Is that a concern?
Well, it is because the Chinese, I don't want to say they're gambling people, but the Chinese want to become wealthy and to join the world first-class countries, and their government is cultivating that culture. They exhibited it beautifully during the Olympics. We have now arrived. We are not an emerging country like Brazil or India. I was in India, and the people over there at the Indian Institute of Management, they say one of the best in the world, they said, we cannot believe we were ahead in the 80s and 90s of China. We had 500 universities, they had 300. Now they have 1,500. There were 300 airports, they had 20, now they have 3,000. So they moved, as we all witnessed, from 1980 to 2005, in those 25, 35 years, remarkably fast. And it is, you can tell when their leaders travel around the world, they expect to be recognized as almost equal. And they inspire their people to say that you're entitled. We want to build the middle class. Go out and invest. We encourage you to do it. In the United States, have you heard anyone saying that the dream of Americans to become wealthy by investing in the stock market? The government keeps quiet.
Right.
You do it on your own because we're a mature country. We experienced the crash in '29, so we know things go up, things go. But they were shocked that things were down.
Right.
Because they had 25 years of great success with the endorsement and the belief that the government is there to help you.
So is that a sign of China taking a step away from being more of a free market economy? We've seen over the last few years, it seems like China becoming more and more westernized and more adapting to free market principles. And yet August we saw sort of a quick running back to...
Correct. It is, what appears is that they want to free their economy and to liberate their institutions, but there is a long tradition that the people expect the government to do something for them. We are very cynical. I mean, when we talk about the government, whether it is in healthcare or in highways, but there it is taken for granted. The same way a 5-year-old expects, good shoes. I'm in a loving family. I don't care what they do. I need shoes. So, and the government nurtures that, because if the government does not do that, then somehow the one-party system will break down.
Right.
If I tell you that I'm the only one and I don't want to take care of you, what's the implication? I'll find somebody else. We need a competing institution.
Right.
So they are having challenges, not only economic but leadership. Then you have every 10 years a leader who wants to be remembered, like Alexander the Great, who did remarkable things for the country and they take a 10-year approach and they say, so the current Premier Xi, I mean, his commitment is, I want my country to be the best. We're very close to the United States in terms of how much we're doing, and I want the middle class to be a strong middle class, successful. Well, this does not happen in 20 years. You need many, many more years, and you need entrepreneurial spirit, we need education, you need... So the stock market get rich quick scheme was a naive tool and backfired.
I agree. It backfired from what we know now, but we still don't know the end game of this stock market.
Of course.
Because I think they might have frightened Western investors a little more longer term to stay out of their stock market. If it's a market you can only get in and not get out, do we really want to invest our money over there?
And this, as you correctly point out, this reminds us of Russia. How many times did we get in Russia thinking that they have adopted the American spirit or the European spirit, and that they're taking care of the business and things are growing, and then all of a sudden they not pay their debts and have bankruptcies, and people who invested have been disappointed.
You mentioned on growth, the slow growth. Larry Summers certainly has commented about it. Recently, when the Fed, after their September meeting, they announced that they collectively have ratcheted down the long-term growth rate for the U.S. economy by a couple tenths of a %, and now they think the long-term growth rate is straddling 2% instead of a couple tenths higher. Where do you stand on that? Do they have it right? Is 2% the right long-term growth rate?
For America, for United States, for us to really exhaust our potential, we need to be growing around 3.5%. I thought, and the books that I read and the papers that I read, I'm a little bit from that period between 85 and 2005, that the economy was doing about 3.5% real growth. And we usually said that the ultimate contributors to growth are 1% population growth and 2% productivity. This way, you and I would expect year after year a good increase in terms of real income, and then the market approximately went by 6–7%. It was the era of the great moderation, and the Federal Reserve was extremely happy, and the politicians, that we were doing well.
And we thought it would last forever.
And we thought it would last forever. The issue at this point is that we do not know which of the two hypotheses is correct. Larry Summers says that because of demographics, and the United States experienced that in the 40s, the same situation, then we had the baby boomers and solved the problem. because of demographics, if population is not increasing enough, over 1.5%, and productivity, it does not seem to be working all that well, and there's lots of controversy how to measure it and what's causing it. So he says that there are fundamental structural problems that cause it. So that's the discussion about we are having some difficulty and we cannot really grow fast. Other people, like Rogoff, says, no, the reason we're having 10 years of slow growth is to be expected when an economy experiences a massive crisis like the one we had. Interestingly enough, they both are a little consistent, because they say whether it's the crisis or is it the moderation, things are slow. Mm-hmm. So how do we really get out of this difficulty? I believe that there is a third contributing factor, and this may be controversial, but you and I know that the last 7 years of the crisis, it is the Fed who carried all the burden to stimulate the economy. The federal government hasn't done anything. Mm-hmm. Whether you're conservative and you say, well, the debt is very high, or you're liberal and you say, give the money. Larry Summers says, build highways. Well, we need new highways, and I read in 5 years, 30% of the cars will be driving in the highways without, electronically. Well, why not build those highways and put the software and get things going? There is complaint that in technology we're doing remarkably well, but when it comes to aviation, airplanes are ready to come and go, but we don't have the electronics and other things to do. In medicine, with people. So if somehow the government not give away money, but in a very constructive economic way, were to collaborate. Remember, when we went to school, it was monetary and fiscal policy. Mm-hmm. We do monetary, and this is why, in many ways, the Federal Reserve has dragged the zero interest rate, the liquidity trap, for 8 years, because there was no help from Congress and fiscal policy.
I believe there'd probably be a third avenue also, because one side of the aisle might prefer to have more government spending, and the other side of the aisle might prefer to have a tax cut, which could also have its stimulative.
Okay, and so exactly correct. And what I was going to say, more or less, to wrap it up, could it be that in a couple of years with new government, then politically fiscal policy becomes active, and either we have a Republican government and we have tax cuts and stimulation, or we loose up a little bit, not in social programs, but so much in terms of capital formation, education, and all the other activities that contribute to productivity.
I read an editorial from Jeb Bush about a month ago, and he said that he believes government deregulation alone could add 3% to GDP. Is that just political talk, or is there anything?
I don't know. Yeah, it would, again, it could add, and it goes back to Reagan and all the things that happened. It's a little paradoxically, we tell the big banks, you became so big and you're so systemically risky at this point that if you have over 2.5 trillion in capital, you have more capital in deposits. Well, what is the effect? You experience it daily. The bond market is not as liquid. So it is conceivable, and this is one example. There may be hundreds of examples. Right? Somehow, the issue is we do not somehow know that optimal level of regulation. You need to empower people to use their judgment, but at the same time, some people don't behave. And unfortunately, we are in a field in finance that if anything goes wrong, immediately they point the finger to people who somehow go beyond what is expected of them and cause crisis.
Right. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for joining me today. This was Professor Tassos Malliaris from Loyola University. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you
My
very much.
pleasure. It was wonderful.